He said it to her on the second day, standing in the yard with 4 children lined up on the porch behind him, listening to every word, and he said it in a voice that was meant to be kind and came out flat as a board. Silas Kern said, "Miss Kesterson, I am going to be plain with you, because you have come 300 miles, and I will not have you finding it out in 6 months. This ranch needs a mother, not a wife. I will marry you Saturday if you will have it, and you will have my name and half of everything and a room with a lock on it that I will never once knock on. And there will be no more to it than that, ever, for as long as we both live. That is not a thing that may change later. I want you to hear me say the word never, so that nobody can tell you afterward that you misunderstood." And Honora Kesterson stood in the middle of that yard in Yavapai County, Arizona Territory, in the March of 1889, with the dust blowing and 4 children watching her out of the shade of that porch, and what she said was, "All right." And then she said, "Which one of them is the youngest?" And Silas Kern had not expected that, and had to think a moment and said, "Tam, she is 3. She does not talk much." And Honora Kesterson said, "Then I will start there," and walked past him up onto that porch. Now, everybody who has ever heard this story wants to know the same thing at the same point. So I am going to answer it right at the front, rather than string you along. He meant it. Silas Kern was not a man playing hard to get, and he was not a man punishing himself out of ordinary grief. He had a reason, and the reason was the worst kind, the kind that is not true and cannot be argued with, because it is not held in the part of a person that arguments reach. His wife had been Rosalind Kern, and she had died on the 14th of June, 1886, 3 hours after giving birth to their 4th child, on a table in the front room of that house, 40 miles from a doctor. And Silas Kern had spent the 2 years and 9 months since then in the private and unshakable conviction that he had killed her by wanting her. I want to be careful about how I put this, because it matters. He was not a stupid man, and he did not go about saying it. If you had asked him, he would have told you that his wife died of a hemorrhage and that it was nobody's fault. But underneath the part of him that knew that, there was another part, and that part had done the arithmetic in the small hours of about 1,000 nights. And the arithmetic went, 4 children in 11 years, and she was not strong after the 3rd, and the doctor at Prescott told us so, and I heard him say it, and I wanted her anyway, and she is in the ground. That is not reasoning. That is a man holding a hot coal and calling it a fact. But it was the load-bearing wall of the whole house by 1889. And everything else in that man's life had been built up against it, and you could not take it out without the roof coming in. So he had made himself a rule. And the rule was that he would never again want anything from a woman that could put her on that table, and he had kept it for 2 years and 9 months, and he intended to keep it until he was dead. And he had 4 children and a ranch and no woman in the house, and in January of 1889 something had happened that meant he could not go on that way any longer. Let me give you the people. Honora Kesterson was 31. She was tall and raw-boned with big shoulders and black hair, going a premature iron gray at the crown, which she wore in a knot and did not dye or hide, and dark eyes set deep, and a nose that had been broken by a gate at 19 and healed with a bump in it. She was not a pretty woman, and had never been one, and had made her peace with it about 15 years before this story starts, which is a thing that gives a certain kind of woman an enormous amount of freedom. She had come out of Bell County, Texas, the eldest of 7, and had raised the other 6 after her mother died when she was 14, and had gone on raising them until the youngest was grown in 1882. And then, at 24 years old, Honora Kesterson had found herself standing in an empty house with nothing whatever to do, and no husband, and no prospects, and no money of her own, having spent 10 years being indispensable to people who no longer needed her. That is a thing that happens to a great many eldest daughters, and almost nobody writes it down. She had been the mother of that family in every way that counted from 14 to 24, and then the family had grown up and gone, quite properly. And she was left holding a set of skills that the world has no use for in an unmarried woman of 24. She went into other people's houses. 7 years of it. Cooking, minding, nursing, a household in Waco, a widower's place near Belton, a hotel, 2 confinements as a monthly nurse. And she was very good at it, and she was never once anything but the hired woman. And at 31 she had $81 and a valise, and the certain knowledge that there was no such thing for her as a family of her own coming along later. And then a letter had come to a boarding house in Belton, Texas, forwarded by a woman she had once worked for from a rancher in Arizona Territory who was advertising for a wife in the plainest terms she had ever read on paper. It said, in the middle of it, I have 4 children under 12 and no woman in this house, and I am about to lose them. I am not offering affection, and I will not pretend to it. I am offering a home, a half share in 8,000 acres, and 4 children who need somebody. Honora Kesterson had read that letter standing up at the foot of the stairs, and had gone and sat down, and had read it 11 more times, and had written back the same night. She was not deceived. This is important, and it is the whole of her. She did not read that letter and think, he will come around. She read it and thought, he is offering me the one thing I have wanted since I was 24 and thought I would never have, and he has been honest with me about the price, and the price is that I will never be loved by anybody as long as I live. And she had thought about that for the length of 1 cup of coffee. And then she had written, I accept your terms exactly as you have set them out. I have raised 6 children who were not my own, and I would rather do that than anything else in this world. Please tell me their names before I come, so that I do not arrive a stranger. He had written back with the names. That is the letter she kept for 51 years. Not the proposal. The list of 4 names in a bad hand on a torn half-sheet, because a man she had never met had thought her question worth answering. I ought to give you that country, because people hear Arizona and think of saguaro and sand, and this was nothing of the kind. The Kern place lay under the Mogon Rim in the north of Yavapai County at about 5,500 feet. Ponderosa pine on the high ground, juniper and grama grass on the benches, a creek that ran cold all year out of the rim rock and went underground in 3 places, and 8,000 acres of it, most of that leased and grazed rather than deeded. There was snow up there in January. There was a fire season in June that would take the whole face of a mountain, and the road went out at Bloody Basin in any serious rain, and stayed out for a week at a stretch, which is why 40 miles to a doctor meant, in practice, no doctor at all for a good part of the year. Silas Kern had come into that country in 1874 at 23 years old with a saddle and a dun horse, and had built the whole of it up from nothing in 12 years. And there is not a thing wrong with a man who does that, except that he generally cannot stop, and by 1886 he was running 1,100 head with 4 hired men. And Fidencio Robles had been his foreman since 1879. Fidencio Robles was 55 in 1889, a small, dry, hard man out of Sonora with a white mustache and hands like tool leather. And he had known Rosalind Kern for 11 years, and had been the one who rode for the doctor on the 14th of June, 1886, and had gotten back with him at 9 the next morning, which was 5 hours too late, and had never once talked about that ride to anybody. He was, and I want this on the record, the only person in Yavapai County who knew both what Silas Kern's rule was and why. He had never been told. He had simply been in that barn on enough nights. Now the town. Camp Verde and Prescott decided about Honora Kern very quickly, and they decided 2 different things, which is not usually how it goes. Camp Verde which is to say the ranch families for 30 miles around, the people who actually had to live out there, took her side inside of about 4 months, and the reason was practical and does them credit. Those women knew exactly what a 12-year-old running a house looks like, because most of them had done some version of it themselves. And when Honora Kern turned up at a school meeting in June of 1889 with a 3-year-old on her hip and asked, straight out, what she had to do to get a girl of 12 caught up 2 years in one, 4 separate women in that room went home and came back the following week with primers and a plan. Winifred Oakes, whose husband kept the store, boarded that girl 3 nights a week for 2 years and would not take proper money for it. Prescott decided the opposite, and Prescott was where the courthouse was. Prescott was a territorial capital with brick buildings and a piano society and a very clear view of what a marriage arranged by letter 8 weeks after a lawsuit amounted to. And Drusilla Vance had lived there for 20 years and knew everybody, and did not have to say one unkind word out loud. She only had to look pained when the subject came up, which she did at length for 14 months. So there were 2 stories running about that household the whole of that year, and the difference between them was distance. The people who could see the house believed one thing. The people 40 miles off believed the other. And it was the people 40 miles off who had the judge. I have noticed that this is generally how it goes with a family that does not look like the picture. Nobody who has actually sat in the kitchen has any doubt. Everybody who has heard about the kitchen is quite certain of the opposite, and there is no arguing with them, because the thing they object to is the shape of it and not one single fact inside it, which is why what happened on the 11th of March, 1890 was so unusual, and why I have told this story for years. A judge in a probate court was handed a household that did not look like the picture, and a 13-year-old girl walked him through the door of it, and he had the sense to go in. That does not always happen. It did not happen to a good many families in that territory in those years, and there are people alive today whose grandmothers were taken 40 miles for the look of the thing. I am not going to pretend otherwise just because this one came out right. Now the thing that had happened in January. Rosalind Kern had a sister. Her name was Drusilla Vance, and she lived in Prescott with a husband named Horace Vance, who dealt in freight and mining supply, and they had a good brick house and no children of their own, and Drusilla Vance had disliked Silas Kern since the day her sister married him. Some of that was ordinary. He was a cattleman on a rough 8,000 acres up under the rim, 40 miles from a doctor and 11 from a neighbor, and Rosalind Vance had been a town girl with a piano, and her sister had said at the time that he was taking her out to die in the brush. And then in June of 1886 Rosalind had died out in the brush, and if you have ever known a person like Drusilla Vance, you will understand that being right about a thing like that does not soften anybody. It sets. And there was one more piece, and it was legal, and it is the engine of everything that happens for the next 14 months. Arizona was a community property territory. What that meant in practice was that everything Silas and Rosalind Kern had built between 1875 and 1886, the deeded home sections, the improvements, the cattle, the whole of it was community property, half his and half hers. And when Rosalind Kern died without a will, her half did not go to her husband. It went to her children in 4 equal parts, held for them until they came of age. Silas Kern's 4 children owned half of that ranch. And a minor cannot manage property, and so the court appoints somebody to do it. And that somebody is called the guardian of the estate, and it is generally the surviving parent, and it does not have to be. On the 9th of January, 1889, Drusilla and Horace Vance filed a petition in the probate court of Yavapai County asking to be appointed guardians of the persons and estates of the 4 Kern miners on the grounds that the surviving father maintained a household unfit for their care, remote, without a woman in it, the eldest child kept out of school to mind the younger. the children going unsupervised for days at a time during gathers. And here is the part that makes it serious rather than absurd. Every one of those things was true. Verity Kern was 12 years old and had been running that house since she was 9.5. She got the little ones up and she cooked what got cooked, and she had been to school for a total of 11 weeks in 3 years. Amos was 9. June was 6. And Tam was 3 years old and did not talk. Not would not, did not, 40 words at 3 years old, because there had not been a woman in that house since the day she was born, and the person raising her was a 9-year-old and then a 12-year-old who had 400 other things to do. Silas Kern read that petition in a lawyer's office in Prescott on the 11th of January and understood in about 4 minutes that his sister-in-law was not lying about anything, and that a judge with a clean conscience might very well hand him a piece of paper in the spring that took his children. His lawyer, a dry old man named Comfort Aldrich, told him the truth. He said, "Silas, they have got a case. It is not a strong case, but it is a real one, and the judge is not going to look at whether you love those children, he is going to look at the house. If there is a competent woman in that house by the hearing, and a marriage certificate, and the eldest girl in a schoolroom, the petition dies. If there is not, I would not care to promise you." And Silas Kern said, "You are telling me to buy a wife." And Comfort Aldrich said, "I am telling you that your daughter is 3 years old and does not talk." He put the advertisement in 3 papers that week. He got 11 answers. 9 of them were from women who wanted a husband and said so prettily, and he burned those, and 1 was from a woman in San Diego who asked first about the acreage, and he burned that one too. And 1 was from a woman in Belton, Texas, who accepted his terms exactly as written, and asked for the children's names. They were married on the 9th of March, 1889, in the front room of that house by a justice of the peace who had come out from Camp Verde, with Fidencio Robles standing witness, and 4 children lined up along the wall in their clean clothes, and it took 11 minutes. And afterward, Honora Kern took off her good dress and put on an apron and made supper for 7 people. Now I will tell you how she did it, because the way she did it is the whole story, and it took her about 9 months. She started with Tam, exactly as she had said in the yard. A child who does not talk at 3 has generally not been talked to, and so Honora Kern talked to that baby without stopping from the 9th of March onward. She carried her on her hip through every chore in that house for 4 months, narrating, "This is a spoon, Tam, this is the fire, we do not touch it. That is your brother, he is a nuisance." She sang. She asked her questions and waited for answers that did not come, and then answered them herself and went on. Tam Kern said 17 new words in April and about 80 in May. And by August of 1889 that child would not shut up, and Amos complained about it at the table, and Honora Kern said, "Good, complain louder." Verity was harder. Verity Kern was 12, and had been the woman of that house for 3 years, and a woman who has held a job that long does not hand it over because somebody new arrives with a marriage certificate. She was polite. She was appallingly polite. She got up before Honora for the first 6 weeks specifically so that the stove would already be lit, and when Honora took over the cooking, Verity Kern stood in that kitchen with her hands empty and did not know what she was for. And Honora Kesterson Kern, who had been the eldest daughter of a motherless family from 14 to 24 and knew precisely and exactly what that girl was feeling, did the only thing that could have worked. She did not take the house away from her, and she did not thank her for her help and pat her on the head. She said, "Verity, you have run this place 3 years, and I have been here 6 weeks, and there are 11 things in this house I do not know, and you are the only person who does. So I am not going to pretend I do not need you. Here is what I want. You are going back to school in September, because the court says so, and because you are owed it. Between now and then, I want you to teach me this house, everything, all of it, and after September you will come home, and this will still be your kitchen too. I am not here to take your place. I am here so that you can have one." And Verity Kern, who had not cried once in 3 years, cried for about 20 minutes, and then went and got the tin where the receipts were kept and started teaching her. The petition did not go away. That is a thing people expect, and it did not happen. Comfort Aldrich got the hearing continued from April to September, and from September to the following March, on various grounds. And every one of those continuances was a small victory that cost money and left the thing sitting there in the middle of that family like a stump in a field. So they lived for 14 months with it. And in 14 months a household changes. Amos Kern, 9 years old, decided in about June that Honora Kern was his personal property and followed her everywhere and told her everything. At length, in enormous detail, including a great many things his father would have preferred not to have broadcast. June, who was 6 and the most silent of the 4 in a different way from Tam, took 11 months, and then one evening in February climbed into Honora's lap without a word during the reading and fell asleep there. And Honora Kern sat absolutely still for an hour and a half rather than move her. And Silas Kern watched all of it from about 4 feet away and kept his rule. He kept it perfectly. I want to say that clearly, because a lesser man in this story cracks in about 6 weeks, and it would be a worse story. Silas Kern never once knocked on that door. He never made a remark that could be taken 2 ways. When they were alone in a room, he was courteous and useful and slightly formal, and if you had put a stranger in that kitchen for an hour, they would have said the 2 of them were a well-matched business partnership, which is exactly what he had advertised for and exactly what he had gotten. And he was in love with her by about the end of that first summer, and it was killing him. Here is how it happened, and there is nothing dramatic in it, which is the point. It happened over a lamp, at 9 o'clock at night, 4 or 5 evenings a week, for a year, because that was when the children were in bed and the 2 of them did the books. She had a head for figures. He had 8,000 acres and 1,100 head, and a set of accounts that had not balanced since June of 1886. By August she had found $400 he did not know he had, and a buyer's discrepancy going back 2 years. And they had fallen into the habit of sitting at that table until 11. They talked about cattle, and then about the children, and then, by winter, about everything. He told her about Rosalind, not the arithmetic, not the coal he was holding, but the ordinary things, the piano and the temper and the way she had laughed at him for being solemn. She told him about Bell County and 6 children and the empty house at 24. And one night in November she said, without any particular weight on it, "Do you know that Tam calls you Papa and calls me Nora?" And Silas Kern said, "Does that trouble you?" And Honora Kern said, "No, she is 3. She calls the dog Dog." And then she said, "It troubles Verity, though. She has been circling it since August." Verity Kern came at it directly in December, because she was 12 years old and her father's daughter. She said, at the table, in front of everybody, "What are we supposed to call you?" And the room went quiet, and Honora Kern put down the dish she was holding and said, "Whatever you decide. I mean that, and I am not going to say it twice, so take your time about it. There is a woman in the ground out there who is your mother, and nobody in this house is ever going to be asked to give her up, and if the answer is Nora forever, then Nora forever is a fine thing to be." That was in December of 1889, and nobody said anything else about it for 2 months. And then in February a thing happened that changed the whole shape of it, and it was not a tender thing. It was a fever. Tam Kern took sick on the 11th of February, 1890, and it went into her chest, and for 9 days that child was as sick as a child gets without dying. 40 miles from a doctor in the winter with the road out at Bloody Basin. Honora Kern did not leave that room for 9 days. She steamed her over a kettle, and she kept her propped up, and she got water into her by the teaspoon around the clock, and she did the thing that nurses did in 1890. which is that she stayed awake so that somebody would be there in the hour when it turned. On the fourth night, Silas Kern came in at 3 in the morning and found her asleep sitting up with the child on her chest, and he stood in that doorway for a long time and then went out and sat on the step in the cold until it got light. And on the 7th night the fever broke, and Honora Kern came out of that room at about 4 in the morning with her hair down and 9 days of no sleep on her, and said, "She is asleep proper. Her skin is cool," and then her knees went, and Silas Kern caught her. That was the only time in 14 months that they touched. He got her into a chair. He put a cup of something in her hands, and Honora Kern sat there shaking with exhaustion and said, "I am sorry. I am sorry. I know the arrangement." And Silas Kern said, do not apologize to me in my own kitchen for falling down after 9 days." And then he stood up and went out, because he did not trust one further word out of his own mouth, and he walked out to the horse pens in the dark in February and stood there until he had it back under control, and what he said out loud to nobody, and I have this from Fidencio Robles, who was in the barn and heard him, was, "No, not her too." That is what he thought he was doing. Right up to the end, he thought that keeping that rule was the thing that kept her alive. There is one more night I have to give you before the courthouse, and it is the 10th of March, 1890, in a rented room at the Williams house in Prescott, with the hearing at 9 the next morning. Honora Kern did not sleep that night either, and it was not about the judge. It was about a thing Comfort Aldrich had said to her that afternoon, privately, in a hallway, with the best intentions in the world. He had said, "Mrs. Kern, tomorrow, that young fellow is going to try to make you say out loud that this marriage is not a real one. Do not let him. Whatever else happens in there, do not give him that." And Honora Kern had gone up to that room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought, "But what if he asks me a question I have to answer honestly?" Here is what was actually in her that night, and it is not what a story usually gives a woman in her position. She was not pining. I want to put that down flatly, because it would be very easy to tell you that she had spent a year aching after a man across a table, and it would be a lie, and it would make her smaller. Honora Kern had gotten, in that year, the thing she had wanted since she was 24 years old and had been certain she would never have: 4 children who were hers to raise, a house that could not be taken away from her at a month's notice, and work that mattered. She was, for the first time in her adult life, not a hired woman. She woke up in the morning with a reason to. What she was afraid of, sitting on that bed, was that a lawyer was going to stand up in a courtroom and describe her life accurately, and that hearing it described accurately would ruin it for her. Because there is a way of putting it that is true and unbearable. A woman who could not get a husband on the open market answered an advertisement from a man in a lawsuit, and took a contract in place of a marriage, and calls another woman's children her own. Every clause of that is a fact. And she had lived a year without ever once letting that sentence get properly finished in her own head. And tomorrow, a stranger from Phoenix was going to finish it for her in public. That is what she was frightened of. Not losing. Being described. And what she did about it, at about 2 in the morning in that rented room, was to get out a sheet of hotel paper and write down, in a column, the things she had actually done in 14 months. It is a very Honora Kesterson thing to do, and it is why I like her. The list went: Tam talks. Verity is at school and has caught up 1 year and 8 months. Amos reads at grade. June sleeps through. Nobody in that house has had lice since May. The books balance, and there is $411 in Prescott that was not there. I have taken 4 children through whooping cough and a chest fever and a broken arm. I know what all 4 of them eat and do not eat, and I have never once made a child eat a thing that makes them sick. And at the bottom of the sheet she wrote, whatever they call it. This is what it did. She folded that paper into her glove and she had it in her hand on the stand the next morning. And she never took it out, and never referred to it, and she kept it, and it is in the same frame in Flagstaff as the list of names. 2 lists. That is what that family kept out of the whole business, a man's list of 4 children's names, and a woman's list of what a year of work had come to. Neither one of them is a love letter. I have come to think that between them they are one. And I will tell you the last thing about that night, because Fidencio Robles was down in the lobby of the Williams house at 4 in the morning and saw it. Silas Kern did not sleep either. He came down at about 3:30 and sat in that lobby in the dark, and Fidencio Robles, who had known him 16 years, came and sat down across from him and said nothing at all for a while, and then said, in Spanish, "If they take them, what will you do?" And Silas Kern said, "Sell the place and move to Prescott and take a job in a freight yard and live down the street from my own children." And Fidencio Robles said, "And her?" And Silas Kern said, "She has got no reason to come to a freight yard in Prescott. The children are the reason." And then he said the thing that Robles repeated to exactly one person in his life 40 years later at a funeral. He said, "That is the arrangement I made, Fidencio. If they take the children tomorrow, I have got no honest way to ask her to stay, because there is nothing left in it that I ever offered her." He had been in love with that woman for 9 months, and had built himself a house with no door in it, and a 13-year-old girl kicked one in the following afternoon, in a courtroom in front of 40 people, without the least idea that she was doing it. The hearing came on at last in the probate court at Prescott on the 11th of March, 1890, and it went badly for about 2 hours. I want to give you it honestly, because a courtroom in a story like this is usually a place where the good people say a beautiful thing and everybody claps, and that is not what a guardianship hearing was. Drusilla Vance's lawyer was a young man from Phoenix named Willoughby Pike, and he was extremely good. He did not attack Silas Kern. That was the cleverness of it. He got up and said, with every appearance of sympathy, that nobody doubted the father's affection, and then he laid out, in order, with dates, 11 weeks of schooling in 3 years for the eldest, a 3-year-old with 40 words, 2 separate occasions in 1888 when the 4 children had been alone on that ranch overnight during a gather, 40 miles to a doctor and a child, nearly dead of a chest fever 4 weeks ago, which he had somehow gotten hold of, and which landed in that courtroom like a dropped plate. And then he came to the marriage. And he did the thing that Silas Kern and Comfort Aldrich had known for 14 months was coming. He put it to the court that the marriage of the 9th of March, 1889, contracted 8 weeks after the petition was filed, to a woman the respondent had never met, arranged entirely by letter, was a device, that it had been entered into for the purpose of defeating this proceeding. And he asked the court to consider whether a household held together by a contract of that kind was materially better for these children than the household the court had been asked to remedy. He was, on the facts available to him, entirely correct. And then he called Honora Kern. I have heard 4 versions of what she said on that stand, and they agree on the substance. Pike asked her whether it was true that she had accepted a proposal of marriage from a man she had never met, by letter, within 8 weeks of the filing of that petition. She said yes. He asked her whether her husband had told her, before the marriage, that there would be no ordinary marital relation between them, ever. She said yes. He asked her, and this is the one that was meant to finish it, whether she would characterize her position in that household as that of a wife or that of a hired housekeeper who had been given a certificate. And Honora Kern said, neither. I would characterize it as their mother. Pike said, you are not their mother, Mrs. Kern. And she said, no, sir. Their mother is buried on that place, and I have taken her 4 children through a whooping cough, a chest fever, and a broken arm, and I could not tell you which of those 2 facts I would give up if you made me choose. And I hope to God nobody ever asks me to." That was good. It was not enough. Pike sat down perfectly happy. Because he had gotten the 2 admissions he wanted on the record, and a jury sympathy speech does not move a probate judge who is thinking about a 3-year-old and a road that washes out. Judge Aldous Kettleman had been on that bench 11 years, and he was not a cruel man, and he was not a fool, and at about 2:30 that afternoon he said, out loud, that he was inclined to appoint a co-guardian of the estate and to require a term of residence in Prescott for the 2 eldest during school terms, which was a way of splitting that family in half with a kind voice. And Verity Kern, who was 13 years old by then and who had been sitting in the second row all day in her good dress with her hands in her lap, stood up. Comfort Aldrich got her sworn. Pike objected and was overruled, because a probate judge in a guardianship matter may hear from the minors, and this one wanted to. And what Verity Kern said in that courtroom is the reason I am telling you this story at all. She said, "Your Honor, my aunt is not lying about us." I want to say that first, because everybody has been saying she is and she is not. I did not go to school. I was 9, and then I was 10, and then I was 11, and I did not go, and my sister did not talk, and we were alone on that place 2 nights in '88, and I was frightened the whole time, and I have never told my father that. She said, "But my aunt has been to our house 4 times in 3 years. 4, I counted them because I was the one who cooked when she came." She said, and the first time she came she said in our kitchen that this was no place for Rosalind's children, and she said it in front of Amos, and then she went home to Prescott and did not come back for 11 months. If she wanted us, she could have come and got us. She could have taken me. I would have gone in '87, Your Honor. I would have gone in a minute. And then Verity Kern said, and Mr. Pike says, the marriage is a device. Well, it was. My father told her so in the yard in front of all 4 of us. And she said all right, and she came anyway. She said, "I have been waiting a year for her to stop." That is what I want to say. Every day since March of last year I have been waiting for her to find out we were a device and go home to Texas. And I watched for it, and it did not come, and in February she did not sleep for 9 days with my sister, and I do not care one bit what the paper it started on says. And then that girl said to a probate judge in Prescott, Arizona Territory, "You can call it whatever you want to call it. It is the only house I have got, and she is in it. Please do not take my brother and me 40 miles from her because of how it started." Judge Kettleman denied the petition on the 14th of March, 1890. He did not do it kindly. He denied the guardianship of the persons outright, and he appointed Comfort Aldrich as guardian ad litem of the estates, with an annual accounting to the court until the youngest child reached majority, which was a considerable inconvenience for 18 years, and which Silas Kern never once complained about. And he put on the record that the school attendance of every child in that household would be reported to the court each term, and that if it failed the petition could be renewed on the same papers, which is to say, he did not find that they had been all right. He found that they were all right now, and he put a chain on the door. Verity Kern started at the school at Camp Verde that September and boarded 3 nights a week with a family called Oaks, and came home every Friday, and Amos went with her the year after, and both of them finished, and neither of them ever lived one day in Prescott. Now the last part. And it is the part I have been holding. They came home from Prescott on the 16th of March, 1890, 5 children and 2 adults in a wagon over 2 days, and there was a great deal of noise and relief, and a supper that went on till 10 o'clock. And after the children were down, Silas Kern and Honora Kern sat at that table with a lamp between them and the books not open, and neither one of them said anything for a while. And then Honora Kern said, "I have got to ask you a thing, and you are not going to like it." That girl stood up in a courtroom, and said the truest sentence in this family out loud in front of 40 people. And it seems to me that the least the grown people in this house can do is manage one between us. And Silas Kern said, "Ask it." And she said, "Why never?" He did not answer for a long time. And then Silas Kern told her the arithmetic. He told her about the doctor at Prescott in 1884 saying that his wife was not strong after the third and ought not to have another. He told her that he had heard it and had wanted her anyway. He told her about the 14th of June, 1886, and about the front room, and what it had been like, and how long 3 hours is. And he said, "So, I do not want to be a man who buries a second one. And every time I have looked at you across this table for a year, I have thought, that is how it starts. That is exactly how it starts. And in February, when you went down in this kitchen, I stood out at the pens and told myself that keeping to it was the thing that was keeping you alive." And Honora Kern listened to the whole of it without interrupting once. And then she said, "Silas, I am going to say 3 things, and then I am going to go to bed, and you may do what you like with them." She said, "The first is that you did not kill her. A hemorrhage killed her. You have made yourself the cause of a thing you did not cause. And I think you have done it because being guilty is easier to carry than being helpless, and I have known 4 other people who did the same, and every one of them was as wrong as you are." She said, "The second is that I am 32 years old, and I have known since I was about 26 that I would very likely never have a child. And I made my peace with that in a rented room in Waco. And I have got 4 now, and I am not asking you for a baby. I want to be very clear, because I think that in your head this is all one thing, and it is not one thing. There is a difference between a man wanting his wife and a man getting his wife with child. And they are not the same, and you have had them welded together for 4 years. And then she said the third thing. She said, "And the third is that you have been so careful of my body for 14 months that it never once occurred to you to be careful of the rest of me. I have sat at this table across from you 4 nights a week for a year. I know what you are, and you know what I am, and we have both of us been very well behaved, and I am going to tell you what your rule has actually protected me from, Silas, since you have never asked. It has protected me from being loved out loud by the only man I have ever wanted, in the only house I have ever had, while sleeping 11 feet away from him." She said, "So you may keep your rule if you need it. I mean that. I will stay either way, and I will not raise it again, and nothing in this house has to change. But do not tell me one more time that it is for my sake." And she went to bed. He did not knock on that door that night, or the next. On the 3rd night, the 19th of March, 1890, Honora Kern came out of that room at about 11 o'clock and found her husband sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, and he stood up when she came in, and what Silas Kern said was, "I have been sitting here 2 days trying to find the words for a thing, and I have not got them. All I have got is that I would like to be married to you, not the paper. The rest of it. And I am frightened of it, and I expect I will be frightened of it for years, and I would rather be frightened with you than be safe on my own for the next 30. And Honora Kern said, well, that was the words. They had 31 years. They had no children of their own, in the end, which I tell you because I said I would be honest, and not because it wants any comment. There was a great deal of talk about it in that county in 1891 and 1892, and then people found something else to talk about, and neither of those 2 people ever said one word on the subject to anybody. And Honora Kern told her eldest daughter once, in 1914, that she had had exactly what she asked for and had never spent an hour wishing for more. Her eldest daughter. That is what she called Verity, and had since about 1892. Verity Kern taught school at Camp Verde and then at Prescott, and married at 26 and had 5. Amos ran the home place until 1938. June went to the normal school and then to California. And Thomasina Kern, who had 40 words at 3 years old, talked for a living. She read law in Phoenix in the 1910s when there were 4 women doing it in the whole territory, and practiced for 31 years and specialized, of all the things in this world, in guardianship and probate. Drusilla Vance was at Honora Kern's funeral in 1940. She was 91. Nobody had asked her to come, and nobody turned her away, and Tam Kern walked her to a chair. And what got kept, and what is in a frame today in a house in Flagstaff, is not the marriage certificate and not the judge's order. It is a torn half-sheet of paper in a bad hand, sent from Arizona Territory to a boarding house in Belton, Texas, in the February of 1889, in answer to the only question the woman had asked before she came. Verity, Amos, June, Thomasina, we call her Tam. He had said the ranch needed a mother and not a wife, and he had meant it. And she had come anyway on those terms with her eyes wide open. She stayed long enough to become both.